Hello and welcome to a new game from CCC 9's bonus final. I covered quite a lot of games from the semi-final, but of course this event also had a final. But Leela wasn't there. Although she had a better score against Stockfish and an equal score versus Leela, she missed the final. Both Stockfish and Leela did better against the rest of the field, and they managed to qualify. And in the final, there was a very big fight between them, and eventually Stockfish managed to win with an extra 7 wins. However, after the final, there were 2 bonus finals at different time controls between Leela and Stockfish, and Leela managed to win them both. And this is now game 73 from the first bonus match, which had similar time controls as the final, and it's a French defense. And Leela started with e4, Stockfish replied with e6, and after d4 and d5, black attacks white's e4 pawn. And white's most popular move here is to defend that pawn with knight c3. This is the Positional variation of the French. And white's idea is that if now black takes here, then he can recapture with the knight. And not only is this knight very beautifully centralized on e4, but it also prevents black's natural developing move, knight f6. Black's problem here is that this knight can take, and now if black doesn't want to ruin his kingside structure, where presumably he wants to castle, then he has to take back with the queen. But now after knight f3, he runs into stuff with bishop g5, harassing the queen. And after bishop g5, actually the queen could only go to these 2 light squares and would be harassed more with the other bishop. So this is not good at all for black. But of course, he doesn't have to play knight f6. Here he can play first knight d7, and only after knight f3 play knight f6. And if now this knight takes, then the other knight can take back, and all is well. And this is called the Rubinstein variation of the French, and it's one of the most solid lines. After knight c3 though, black doesn't necessarily need to take here right away on e4. He can play first bishop b4 to pin this knight on c3 and threaten again to win a pawn. And this is the most popular move in this position, and it's called the Winawer variation, and is one of the sharpest variations in the French. And here now white again has a couple of moves. He can take on d5, or play knight e2 and then try to get the bishop pair with a3. But probably the best move here is e5. This move accomplishes at least 3 things for white. Well, of course, first of all, it saves the pawn because we pushed it forward. And secondly, it takes away f6, the most natural developing square for this knight. And now the knight needs to go somewhere else. And thirdly, it makes g7 a very vulnerable square in black's camp. By taking away f6 not only from the knight but also the queen, g7 is very difficult to defend, as we'll see immediately. Black's best move here is c5, trying to get rid of this d4 pawn, and if white has to recapture with a piece, then e5 will be also more vulnerable. So white usually plays here a3, try to make this bishop take and then recapture the b pawn. The bishop can also retreat, that's also a variation, but it's losing time for black. Best is just to take this knight, and now after b takes on c3, the d4 pawn is also defended by a pawn. Black now plays here knight e7 and he wants to castle, but here lies the problem in this Winawer variation. White now plays queen g4, attacks g7, and that square is very difficult to defend. g6 would be what's called a positional blunder, because you are weakening all the dark squares in your camp, and white has a dark square bishop and you don't, and that would be a very big mistake, especially at this level. Instead of g6, black could maybe play rook g8, but then h7 is weak, and this bishop could go to d3 and attack it, or the queen could attack it. The best defense here is, as we've seen also in an early game in the Nimzowitsch-Larsen attack a couple of videos back, the best move here is king f8 and not weaken your king side. But of course now this rook is kind of stuck in the corner. In this game though, after knight c3, instead of bishop b4, we have the second most popular defense for black, and that is knight f6, and this is the classical French. The game continued now with bishop g5, burn variation, and after bishop e7, e5, and knight d7, we have h4, and this is called the Alekhine-Chatard attack. White's idea here is that this bishop on g5 is super annoying for black. It keeps this bishop in a pin and it makes black's development a lot more difficult. And if black tries to get rid of him, then after h takes on g5, the h file opens up for an attack, and castling kingside for black is very dangerous now. For example, if the queen takes this pawn, then knight h3 wins some time in the attack, and if the queen goes back to e7, then queen g4, and now castling for black is just losing the game, because here after knight f4, white is already threatening to castle long and then sack his rook on h7. For example, after c5, long castles. If knight c6, then it's game over. The rook takes on h7, king takes, bishop d3 check, king back, rook h1. And this position is now beyond salvation for black. White is threatening this idea with rook h8 check, winning the tempo, and then queen h5 check and queen h7 mate. So after h4, instead of taking the bishop, black played here h6, trying to make this bishop take here, and taking there is actually a legit variation in this attack, but here we now have bishop e3, and now black pretty much has to give up castling because white is always threatening here to take on h6, and the king side is just quite simply a no-go zone for the king at this point. The game continued with c5, and now we have queen g4 attacking g7, king f8. This rook has to guard h6 all the time. And now after f4 we have reached the end of the book, and there are a couple of games in this position. Most notably, Alexei Shirov managed to win here once with white. Stockfish continued with knight c6, putting even more pressure on d4, and now after knight f3 he played knight b4, threatening to fork on c2. And Leela could defend here c2 with the king by playing king d2 or king d1, or with the rook by playing rook c1. But with black having the possibility to take on d4 and open lines, this king wouldn't feel so well in the center of the board, so Leela decided to castle long. But this is a move that she will undo shortly. Stockfish decided now to close the center with c4, and Leela can stop worrying about the center, but she has to worry now very much about a queenside attack, because it's coming very quickly. Here she played a3 to drive the knight back, and now she played h5 to fix black's kingside pawns and use h4 for a piece, but Stockfish went into attack immediately without wasting any time with b5. And of course, taking this pawn would be a complete suicide, because not only would open the b5 for an attack, but it would also lose a lot of time. Knight takes on b5, lost already a tempo. After queen b6, knight back to c3 loses another tempo, and now after rook b8, white is in big trouble. The b2 square is undefensible. Something like knight a4 just runs into queen b5, and the king has no choices. He has to run. But of course that wouldn't save the game, and black would be winning after queen takes on b2. But of course after b5 Leela didn't take this pawn, and she didn't want to wait for the black army to get to her king, so she thought that leaving sooner is better than later, and she sent her king into a long journey to the king side. The game continued with rook b8, king e1, a5, and b4 is unstoppable. So Leela played here rook a1, and the white king is basically uncastled. And of course after b4, a takes b, and opening the a file for the rook is an idea, but Leela had a completely different idea, and she played here knight d1, and she wants to maintain a pawn on a3, so that if the pawn takes here now, then she can recapture with the b pawn, and b4 is unavailable for the black piece. And also the knight from d1 is nicely guarding the b2 square, b3 is guarded by the pawn, b1 by the rook, and there are essentially no entry points into white's position. So instead of taking on a3 after knight d1, Stockfish didn't take here but played knight b6, and he wants to jump with the knight to a4 and then take this pawn, and then he can jump with the knight to b2 and challenge this knight on d1 and maybe gain the b2 square for a rook. So at this point, Leela thought that she has to take now on b4 to guard the a4 square, and now we have knight takes on b4 instead of a takes on b4, again threatening a fork on c2. So Leela's king had to stop his journey and went back to d2 to defend the pawn. And now we have a4, Stockfish is advancing, bishop e2, bishop d7, c3, trying to push the knight back, but now we have a3. Stockfish calculated that actually taking the knight would be losing for black after bishop b4 check, king c2, bishop a4 check, king c1, a takes on b2, knight takes, bishop b3, bishop d1, trying to take this bishop, queen c8, if the bishop takes, the c file opens up, knight d2, and now c3, and black is crashing through here. After knight takes on b3, the pawn takes on b2, we check, king takes, and now comes bishop c3 check, winning back an exchange, and now queen c3 check, king a2, and now knight c4, threatening mate on b2. And after bishop c1, there's queen d3, taking away the b1 square. b2 is already taken away by the knight, so rook a8 is now threatening mate. Bishop a3 check, knight takes, king takes, and now queen c3, taking away b4 and b2, and again threatening mate. And after king a2, the rook can take on b3, bishop takes, and now after king e7, this rook is coming into the game with a check and with the deadly threat of mating the king on a1. And here white can play queen d1 in order to block this check with the bishop, but it's not enough. After queen b4, this bishop will be lost, rook h3, rook takes on a4 with check, and also the queen has to give up its life now. And after queen takes on a4 and rook a3, this is now just a walk in the park for that queen, and black wins. So of course after a3, Leela didn't take the knight, but she took the pawn on a3, sending this knight back. And even though Stockfish's queenside attack looks dangerous, he never thought that he's better in this position. Actually, they both evaluated this position pretty much equal. Leela thought maybe that it's a very little plus for white, but nothing serious. The game now continued with king e1. The king is resuming his journey to the king side. Knight a4, king f2, knight a7, king g1, king g8, and now rook h3, planning rook g3 with pressure on g7. We have now knight b5 attacking c3, bishop d2, and from now on Stockfish had the chance to take this pawn on a3, but he's not concerned with that extra pawn of white's. He's much more concerned with the c3 pawn. That's much more important for him because it also defends d4, but winning that pawn is not easy at all. He could try to put more pressure on it with queen a5, but the truth is that taking that pawn with either knight at any point is just too dangerous because they walk into a pin. And Leela can also add a lateral support with the rook if needed. The game continued with rook h7, bishop e1, rook back to h8, rook g3, rook h7, king h2, rook b6, and they shuffle a bit. And now after rook h3 and king g8, Leela makes some progress with knight h4. We have queen b6, but after bishop f3, Stockfish realizes that this game will end badly for him. The queen went back to d8, queen g3, knight c7, knight e3, optimizing her pieces, knight b2, finally one of Stockfish's pieces gets into white's position, the knight wants to get to d3, but after bishop d2, knight d3, we have bishop e2, and Leela is preparing to take out this knight, but first we have rook a8, maybe trying to get this pawn, but Leela stops it with knight g4. The dark-squared bishop needs to guard f6, otherwise white wins an exchange after rook takes, bishop takes on d3, pawn takes, knight f6 check, and losing the exchange is only the start for black's problems. So instead of taking the pawn after knight g4, Stockfish played here rook b8. And now we have bishop takes, pawn takes, and knight f3, anticipating this rook coming down to b2 and defending this bishop. And after rook b2 we have knight f2, trying to get the d3 pawn and trying to force this rook back. But the bishop defends the pawn, however d1 is still available for the knight. We have first a4 and after bishop a6, knight d1. And the rook could come to c2 here and try to stay on the 7th rank, but Leela could play queen f2 to defend this bishop and then knight e1 and either win this rook or exchange it after bishop here and rook a2, both favorable to Leela. So after knight d1, Stockfish played instead rook b3, and now we have queen g4, queen b8, rook g3, and king h8. Trying to get into the first rank with rook b1 doesn't really work, because after rook takes and queen takes, Leela just plays knight e3, and everything is defended in Leela's camp except this pawn on a4, which doesn't count anyway, and Leela can just quite simply continue with her attack with f5. So after rook g3, Stockfish played king h8, and now we have a5, queen d8, and now since rook b1 is not possible, Leela is going for the d3 pawn with knight e1, and after rook b8 she takes the pawn, king g8, and now we have knight b4. And not only Leela is keeping Stockfish in a mating threat, but she also has now a good position on the queen side. If the bishop takes now here, then she has two connected passed pawns. So instead of that, Stockfish played bishop b5, and now the game continued with knight e3, rook a8, queen f3, bishop h4, rook h3, bishop back to e7, a little back and forth here, and eventually after bishop e7 we have now bishop e1. Leela is going to exchange her bad bishop, queen c8, bishop h4, bishop takes, rook takes, knight a6. Stockfish is attacking this pawn on c3, so Leela defends it, and now we have knight takes, and queen d8 going for the a5 pawn. But Leela doesn't care about that pawn, and she just plays rook h3, rook takes, queen takes, and they exchanged a pair of rooks. But Leela now continues her attack with f5, and Stockfish is playing without a rook. Stockfish went now for a queen exchange with queen a1 check, king h2 and queen f1. The queen exchange would allow him to unblock this rook without worrying about mates. But Leela ignored the threat and played here f6. The queen takes queen, pawn takes, and now we have g5. And Stockfish wants to play rook h8, king a7, and then rook c8, probably. So Leela thought that it's best to take here en passant, and after f takes, she played f4, and after king f8, she played rook g3, attacking this pawn. Stockfish pushed the pawn forward, f takes, h takes, we check, and now Leela went for a rook exchange, which would lead into a completely winning endgame. Stockfish accepts, rook takes, king g3, and this is of course a winning endgame for white, but it's not easy at all, because if you go rook g4 to approach this pawn, then you run into checks and stuff. So Leela reroutes now the knight to c5 and attack e6 and keep this bishop busy. So we have king f2, bishop e8, knight a6, bishop d7, knight c5, and now bishop c8. And now the king can go back to attack this pawn. However, after king g4 and king h6, we can see that this king can pivot between these two squares, so you can't really force the king away from the pawn, so you need the knight to take this pawn. One straightforward win for white to win here would be to play knight b3 and transfer this knight to f3 and then take this pawn. And trying to check the king from behind would be the wrong approach here for black, because after knight d2 check, white would have knight f3, and you can't take this knight because then this is a winning king and pawn endgame for white. And after king g6, king g3 and bishop somewhere, the knight could now take on g5, making use of the fact that the king can't take because this pawn then runs in and queens. But after knight b3, black can go another route with bishop d7 and try to check this king away from the pawn. And here now, after bishop d7, knight d2, bishop e8, knight f3, there's this check. And after king back, this knight can take on g5 because f7 is now guarded by this bishop. However, after bishop d7, knight d2 and bishop e8, this knight is not forced to come to f3 and attack g5. White can play here c4 here, and after this check by black and king g3, black has to take on c4. And after that, an easy idea would be to play knight b7 and from there go to d8, where from this knight attacks both e6 and f7, and that would lead to a win for white. For example, if the bishop goes back here to defend this pawn from d7, then after knight d8, bishop d7, the king can now come to g4, and after king g6 there's f7, and the king has to go with the pawn now, losing the pawn on g5. And now after bishop somewhere, white can queen the pawn to lure the king away from f6, and after king f6, this is now easy. The knight takes on e6, and with two pawns white wins. After knight b7, another way instead of bishop e8 would be to play king g6, and after knight d8 try king f5 and defend the e6 like this, but this also allows f7 and the bishop has to give himself up. And after king e4, knight can take on g5, and after king d4, black threatens to draw by taking here, but there's king f4 and white wins again. And the third way to win this would be if after knight b7, black would try to defend the pawn from c4 with the bishop, but nothing much changes here. Same tactic with f7 works, and after king g7, black loses this pawn. Of course, black can take this knight because the pawn queens, and after king g6, black again loses this pawn on e6, and shortly after that the game. But after king h6, Leela didn't go for this knight b3 variation. She played king h3, and Stockfish's rook gradually went further and further away from the g5 pawn, allowing this knight now to come and catch it, attack it here. Basically now Stockfish is forced to push this pawn, but now this pawn is easily won down by placing the king to g3 and the knight to e3, and there's nothing that bishop can do. And Leela will transfer now her king to c5, where from it will try to get into d6, and the knight will go eventually to g5, where it is now, to support f7, and here the king is going towards c5, and now we have f7. The king has to go there, and now the knight defends it, and after bishop a2, now Leela again has this tactic of taking on e6 and promoting if the king takes the knight. So the king had to take the pawn, but now Stockfish loses all his pawns, and from here on is really easy. Leela will promote one of her pawns to a queen and the other one to a knight. Here we go immediately. It takes some time. There's the queen, and shortly after that I think we'll have a knight. There you go. And now we'll have Stockfish giving up his bishop for that pawn, and then the mate will follow soon with queen and king. That knight is just there to watch the show. That was a great game. Please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other videos. Thanks for watching and see you soon. Bye bye.